The Chicago dawn didn't arrive gently. It tore through the night with a fiery orange gash across Lake Michigan, reflecting off the glass and steel skyscrapers. Inside a penthouse on the 87th floor, where the city was a glittering carpet of light, below the early morning sun, crept in, illuminating a special scene. Zoe Washington's room was a perfect blend of a tech prodigy and a 12-year-old girl. Three high-end computer monitors dominated one corner, displaying a relentless flowing river of green code. Next to them, a whiteboard was covered in complex algorithms, but on the walls beside circuit diagrams were whimsical drawings of planets and starships. Under the desk, a half-finished robotics project lay next to a worn-out, stuffed unicorn. Zoe, dressed in pajamas, adorned with constellations, sat there, her small fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard that clicked softly. She was finalizing the last lines of code for Etheria, the AI-powered learning platform she had created at the age of 9. Etheria wasn't just an app. It was a revolution, a tool that could adapt to each child's unique learning style, especially for children with disabilities. The door creaked open, and David Washington walked in, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. The sweet aroma filled the room, overpowering the faint scent of ozone from the electronics. He placed one mug on the desk, right next to a framed photo of the 2 of them at the Museum of Science and Industry. David had been a science teacher in a tough public school on Chicago's South Side. He had seen too much potential, wasted too many sparks extinguished by a lack of resources and a rigid educational system. He looked at the complex code on the screens, something he didn't truly understand, but he understood the fire in his daughter's eyes. It was the same fire he had tried to ignite in hundreds of students, but only in Zoe had it blazed into a brilliant star. "Ready to make history, Starlight?" he asked in his deep, warm voice, like an embrace. Zoe turned a fleeting smile, quickly replaced by a flicker of anxiety. "I don't know, Dad. I'm nervous. I'm flying to Silicon Valley, getting the Innovator of the Year award, and giving a keynote to thousands of people. When they see me on that stage, they're not just going to see an inventor, are they? They're going to see a 12-year-old black girl." David knelt, a familiar gesture from her toddler years, bringing their eyes to the same level. He looked deeply into his daughter's clear eyes. "They're going to see a 12-year-old black girl, and that is exactly why you have to shine brighter than anyone else in that room, Zoe. Not to prove them wrong, but to show other little girls who look just like you, sitting in their classrooms, feeling invisible, that it is possible. You are their living proof." His words were a current of energy. Zoe took a deep breath and nodded, her resolve solidifying. The weight of the day was immense, but her father's love was greater. She held the warm mug of hot chocolate, feeling its comfort spread through her. She was ready. The first-class cabin of the 767 was a separate world. Wide, cream-colored leather seats, the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the soft rustle of financial newspapers created an atmosphere of success and tranquility. Zoe had settled into seat 2A by the window, carefully placing her laptop, adorned with science-themed stickers, on the tray table. She wasn't watching movies or playing games. She pulled out her worn-out notebook, a repository of half-finished ideas, and began sketching a new design for a haptic feedback interface. Lost in her own world, the surrounding sounds faded away. David sat in premium economy, just behind the curtain. He could have easily afforded first-class tickets for both of them, but he wanted Zoe to understand the value of privilege. He was her silent guardian, giving her space, but always within sight. That elegant tranquility was shattered by the arrival of Arthur Vance. He practically stormed into the cabin, his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. His expensive Armani suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his face was flushed with anger. "I don't care what you have to do. Save the Los Angeles School District contract," he snarled into the phone. "It's our last chance. Don't fail me on this." After ending the call with a curse, he stuffed the phone into his jacket pocket. His frustration radiated like a toxic cloud. His eyes scanned the cabin and landed on Zoe. At first, it was just an impatient glance, but it morphed into an annoyed scowl as he checked the seat number on his ticket. He didn't approach immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, sighing dramatically as if her very existence was a personal inconvenience to him. Finally, he strode over. "Excuse me," he said, his voice curt and impatient, making no effort to hide his irritation. "This is my seat." Zoe looked up, a little startled by his hostile tone. She felt a familiar, weary feeling. This wasn't the first time she had been looked at this way. She calmly held out her boarding pass, which clearly read, "Zoe Washington, seat 2A. "I'm sorry, sir, but my pass says this is 2A. Arthur glanced at the pass in her small hand, then at her notebook filled with technical drawings. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. His annoyance quickly turned into open disdain. "There must be some mistake. I booked this seat. I need it." His gaze swept past Zoe, past her neatly braided hair, past her intelligent eyes, and landed somewhere behind her, as if she were merely a temporary obstacle to be cleared. It was a small incident, an inconvenience, but for Zoe, it was a bitter reminder that the world outside her penthouse wasn't always kind. The flight attendant, a woman named Claire, with a smile trained to remain calm in any situation, quickly appeared. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vance?" "Yes," Arthur replied, pointing at Zoe as a prosecutor might point at a defendant. "This child is in my seat, and I need you to handle this, now." Claire gently took both boarding passes. She swiped them through her device, and the screen confirmed the undeniable. She looked up at Arthur, her professional smile now slightly strained. "Sir, Miss Washington is in her correct seat 2A. According to the system, your seat is 12C in premium economy just behind us. It's also a very good seat." Her last sentence, an attempt to de-escalate, had the opposite effect. Premium economy. Arthur nearly shouted, his voice laced with disbelief and outrage. The sound caused several other passengers to look up from behind their magazines. "Do you know how much money I spend with this airline every year? I'm a platinum member. I need to work. I have important calls to make. What in the world does a child need a first-class workspace for to doodle?" He gestured contemptuously toward Zoe's notebook. Zoe felt a hot blush creep up her cheeks. She wanted to disappear. She clutched her notebook, trying to maintain a calm expression, but a small storm was brewing inside her. David, from behind the curtain, had heard everything. A father's anger rose within him. He stood up, ready to step forward and erect a protective wall around his daughter. But before he could say a word, another voice spoke. It wasn't loud, but it was cold, sharp, and commanding, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. "Arthur." The voice came from the elegant woman sitting across the aisle who had put down her Wall Street Journal. Arthur spun around, his face draining of color as he recognized the speaker. "Mother, what are you doing here?" He stammered, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by the panic of a schoolboy caught misbehaving. Eleanor Vance looked directly at her son, her cold gaze offering no mercy. "I'm observing," she said, her voice even, but every word landed like a hammer blow. "And I'm observing a man who is about to embarrass the Vance family name over an airplane seat. Your desperation is showing, Arthur. Don't take your professional failures out on a child." Each word was a public whipping of his pride. The first-class cabin fell silent, all eyes fixed on the family drama unfolding. He had been ruthlessly exposed by his own mother in front of everyone. Humiliated before his mother and the entire first-class cabin, Arthur Vance retreated. His face was a burning mixture of rage and shame. He didn't dare look at his mother, the woman whose shadow he had spent his entire life trying to escape. He didn't dare look at Zoe, the girl who now embodied his public failure. He just muttered an incoherent apology and turned, walking quickly toward the economy cabin, like a defeated soldier fleeing the battlefield. The feeling of dozens of eyes on his back made the nape of his neck burn. The plane took off, soaring into the blue sky, leaving Chicago behind. Zoe tried to push the incident out of her mind. Everything seemed to be returning to normal. But for Arthur, the storm inside him was just beginning. Squeezed into seat 12C between two other passengers, he felt suffocated. The shame quickly gave way to a more toxic emotion, resentment. He didn't see himself as the villain. In his mind, the story had been rewritten. He was the victim, a victim of a useless airline, a harsh economy, and above all, his own mother who had always looked down on him. That little girl, with her infuriatingly calm expression, and her father, who was surely gloating behind the curtain, were symbols of everything conspiring against him. Their easy success was an insult to his struggle. About 20 minutes later, after the plane had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had switched off, Arthur stood up. He discreetly made his way to the small galley area in the middle of the plane where the crew phone was located. He glanced around, making sure no flight attendants were watching. With fingers trembling with rage, he made a short call. "I want to report a security concern on Flight 767 to San Francisco," he whispered into the receiver, his voice venomous. "There's a minor, Zoe Washington. I have reason to believe she is traveling under a false identity and may be part of a larger illegal operation. Her father, David Washington, is also on board. You need to check them out." He hung up, his heart pounding. A vicious smile flickered across his lips. He had regained a little control. He had thrown a stone into a calm lake. He had no idea he had just thrown a boulder into a powder keg. Shortly after Arthur returned to his seat, the cabin's PA system crackled to life with a dry bing. The captain's voice came on, no longer friendly, but cold and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to receiving an urgent security alert, we are required to divert our course and land at Oakland International Airport. Airport security will be boarding the aircraft upon our arrival." A wave of confusion and alarm spread through the cabin. David immediately looked toward his daughter, his heart sinking with a terrible premonition. In seat 12C, Arthur Vance sat frozen, his face as white as a sheet. He realized he had gone too far. There was no going back now. The plane didn't taxi to the main terminal at Oakland International Airport. It was guided to a remote, isolated corner of the airfield surrounded by vehicles with flashing blue and red lights. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had grown thick with tension and fear. Passengers were ordered to remain in their seats, the anxious whispers having died down into a heavy silence. The cabin door opened. Two men in dark suits, their faces grim and their FBI badges clipped to their lapels, boarded the plane. They didn't rush. Their every step was deliberate and authoritative. They conferred briefly with the flight crew, and then one of them, Agent Hatcher, walked directly to Zoe's row, ignoring everyone else. "Zoe Washington and David Washington." He asked, his voice devoid of emotion, as if reading from a report. David stood up, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder like a shield. "Yes, that's us. What's going on, Agent?" You'll need to gather your personal belongings and come with us, Agent Hatcher said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. They were escorted off the plane, walking past the curious and fearful faces of the other passengers. Zoe felt like a criminal. Every stare was a needle piercing her skin. They were put into an unmarked black sedan and driven to a sterile security building. They walked down long, empty corridors under the cold glare of fluorescent lights. Finally, they were led into a small room. It contained only a metal table, a few hard plastic chairs, and a large one-way mirror on the wall. Agent Hatcher shut the door, the sound echoing in the silence. "We'll get straight to the point," he said, flipping open a notebook. "This morning, we received an anonymous tip. The tip alleged not only that you were traveling under false pretenses." He paused, looking directly at David, his eyes as sharp as a hawk's. "The tip alleged that the company Etheria and Miss Zoe Washington here are merely a front. That you, David Washington, are using your daughter's startup to conduct a transnational money laundering operation and to conceal the large-scale theft of intellectual property from a rival tech corporation." The accusation landed like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just absurd. It was diabolical, perfectly designed to destroy. David was stunned for a moment, then anger flared, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. Fear for his daughter. "That's insane. That's a complete lie. Who told you this?" Zoe sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock. Her world, a world built on logic, numbers, and clean code, was beginning to fracture. The words money laundering and theft echoed in her head. She didn't understand what they meant, but she could see their devastating effect on her father's face. "We need to question you separately, Mr. Washington," Agent Hatcher said to David, his voice as monotonous as a machine. Another agent opened the door, his emotionless gaze beckoning David to follow. "Wait," David protested, his voice desperate. "I can't leave my daughter, a 12-year-old child, alone in here with you." "It's the procedure, sir," Hatcher replied flatly, leaving no room for negotiation. "Cooperation will make this easier for everyone." Helpless, David gave his daughter one last look, his eyes filled with rage, fear, and a silent promise that he would do anything to protect her before he was led out of the room. The heavy metal door slammed shut, the click of the lock echoing like a final judgment. Zoe was now alone with Agent Hatcher in the cold room. The silence was terrifying. She could hear her own heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at her hands on her lap. They were trembling uncontrollably. The room seemed to be sucking all the air, all the warmth out of her. She felt more lost and scared than she had ever been. The world of algorithms and logic, where everything had rules and could be predicted, had vanished. In its place was a world of absurdity and malice, a world she didn't understand. Agent Hatcher flipped a page in his notebook. "Zoe," he began, his tone unchanged, "do you know the passwords to Etheria's main servers?" The question, though just part of his investigative process, felt like a conviction. It implied she was no longer a prodigy, but a suspect, an accomplice. It was the final straw. All the strength, all the composure the 12-year-old girl had managed to maintain, until now finally shattered. She didn't sob or scream. Instead, a single hot tear silently rolled down her cheek, then another. Her small shoulders began to shake. She took a breath, trying to speak, but her throat felt tight. She looked up at Agent Hatcher, the man with the impassive face, and asked in a trembling, broken voice, a question from the very bottom of a child's heart. What did I do wrong?" she whispered. Is my dad going to go to jail because of me?" The innocent, devastating question hung in the air. It revealed the crushing weight of guilt she had placed upon herself, believing that her own talent and success had brought this catastrophe upon the father she loved most. Even Hatcher's stony expression seemed to flicker with a moment of unease. At that exact moment, the door burst open, not by an agent, but by someone else. Eleanor Vance strode in, followed by two lawyers in expensive suits who looked sharp and powerful. The sound of her heels clicked decisively on the concrete floor. She placed her Hermes handbag on the cold metal table, the clack of its golden clasp echoing in the silence, a declaration of her presence. She didn't even glance at the FBI agent. Her eyes were focused entirely on Zoe, and the icy mask on her face melted, replaced by a fierce, protective warmth. "No, my dear," she said, her strong, commanding voice a life raft in the middle of a storm. "You did absolutely nothing wrong." She turned to Agent Hatcher. "I am Eleanor Vance. My son Arthur made that call, and I am here to fix his mistake. My lawyers will handle everything from now on." The arrival of Eleanor Vance and her legal team was like a hurricane sweeping through the stuffy interrogation room. Everything happened with breathtaking speed and efficiency. The two lawyers, one a former federal prosecutor, the other a legend in Silicon Valley intellectual property law, got to work. They didn't argue. They presented facts. They produced a thick binder. Inside was irrefutable evidence, encrypted emails, recorded phone calls, and suspicious financial transactions. They proved that Arthur Vance, in his desperation over his failing business, had been approached by a rival tech company called Nexus Edu. Nexus Edu had fed him the vicious and false information about Etheria, promising to throw him a lifeline if he helped them eliminate the rising competitor. "Agents," the former prosecutor said, his voice like steel. "Nexus Edu exploited Arthur Vance's desperation. They knew he was in financial trouble. They also knew he had a strained relationship with his mother, whom they happened to know was one of Etheria's anonymous investors. They used this family rift to execute their dirty plan." The evidence was overwhelming. The case had turned 180 degrees. David was brought back into the room, his face still etched with stress, but now holding a flicker of relief as he saw Eleanor and the lawyers. The investigation into the Washingtons was over. A new investigation into Nexus Edu and Arthur Vance was just beginning. As the agents and lawyers discussed the next steps, Eleanor sat down in the chair across from Zoe and David. The powerful aura around her had softened, replaced by a rare sincerity. She looked directly at David. "I owe you an apology, David. There is no excuse for Arthur's actions." She sighed, her gaze distant. "My husband, Arthur's father, was a brilliant but weak man. He never knew how to face failure. I'm afraid Arthur inherited that. Power and fear can make good men do terrible things." Then she turned to Zoe, her eyes now warm with admiration. "But you, Zoe, you have a different kind of power. It doesn't come from money or status. It comes from your intellect and a pure heart. The world will not stop throwing stones at you, Zoe. Your job is not to dodge them, but to use them to build your empire." She paused, then revealed one last secret. "I was one of Etheria's first anonymous angel investors. I've been watching your progress from afar. I invested secretly because I wanted to see what you could build without the shadow of the Vance name influencing things. And you did not disappoint, Zoe. You have surpassed all of my expectations." 6 months later, the main stage of Silicon Valley's most prestigious tech conference was bathed in light. Zoe Washington stood there, holding the Innovator of the Year award. The auditorium, filled with thousands of the industry's brightest minds, was giving her a thunderous standing ovation. In the audience, David Washington wiped away tears of pride. Beside him, Eleanor Vance, applauded enthusiastically, her face beaming. She was no longer a secret investor, but the chairwoman of Etheria's board, a mentor and friend. In a quiet corner at the back, Arthur Vance also stood. He had come of his own free will, part of a long journey of atonement. As he watched Zoe, he quietly made a large donation on his phone to the Children's Center where he now volunteered. It was a silent act of trying to build something good from the wreckage he had caused. Zoe raised a hand, and the applause slowly subsided. She stepped to the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "Thank you," she began. "6 months ago, I learned that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. But today, I've also learned that the truth, once it stands, is immovable." She looked out at the sea of faces. Technology gives us extraordinary tools, but those tools are meaningless without compassion. Our generation's task is not just to write code for machines. Our more important task is to recode the compassion in our own hearts, to build a world where a person's worth isn't measured by their skin color or their age, but by what they contribute. She paused, letting the words resonate, then delivered her final thought. Because the greatest code doesn't run on silicon. It runs in our veins, and it's called kindness. The applause erupted once more, a wave of respect and hope. As Zoe walked off the stage, she was met with an embrace, first from Eleanor and then from her father. The three of them stood together for a moment, a new kind of family forged in crisis and united by purpose. A brilliant and promising future had just begun. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe to Toch Story for more content that moves and inspires you. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below.